Before we begin, a quick warning. Tennessee True Crime contains detailed descriptions and images of real-life violence. Some listeners and viewers may find the material deeply disturbing. This content is intended for mature audiences only. And remember, the goal of sharing these stories is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor the victims, understand the truth, and give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Listener discretion is strongly advised. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Donelson, Tennessee, February 16th, 1997. The kind of morning where most folks were just easing into their day. Coffee was brewing, kids were getting dressed for church. The whole world was just moving slow. But inside the Captain D's on Lebanon Road, something unimaginable was happening. A crime so cold and so calculated that even seasoned investigators struggled to understand the level of brutality behind it. Today, we're walking you through each moment of that morning, piece by piece. Because, like investigators in 1997, we're going to follow the clues as they came, slowly, painfully, and with more questions than answers. They say the South never forgets, and Tennessee, she remembers everything. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime, where the shadows of the volunteer state's past meet the stories that refuse to be forgotten. I'm your host, Tiffany Morgan. Each week, we dig into twisted tales of betrayal, violence, and mystery. The ones where whispers carry truth and the answers are never as simple as they seem. Let's step into the dark and piece together the clues. Because in Tennessee, some secrets still haunt the hills. This is Tennessee True Crime.
Down through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime.
16-year-old Sarah Jackson and 25-year-old Steve Hampton were opening the restaurant for a Sunday service. Steve was the manager, and Sarah was a hardworking high school student picking up extra hours. Now, between 8:15 and 8:30 a.m., Steve spoke on the phone with Kevin Blackwell, who was the area director. Nothing sounded unusual. But sometime after that call, someone entered the building. Someone armed. Someone prepared. What happened inside that restaurant over the next hour would stay hidden until almost lunchtime. Around 9:45 to 10 a.m., employee Michael Butterworth arrived for his shift, and the doors were locked. That was not normal. He called the restaurant, but he got a busy signal. So he called again and still got no answer. Butterworth knew that something was not right. So he reached out to another employee whose father was actually a Metro Nashville police officer, Officer Jeff Wells. So between 11 a.m. and noon, after the assistant manager unlocked the door, Officer Wells stepped inside. And there, inside the walk-in cooler, Steve Hampton and Sarah Jackson lay face down on the floor. Both of them had been shot execution style. Steve had been shot 3 times, twice to the back of his head and once in his back. Sarah had been shot 5 times, 4 to her head and 1 to her back. Now, the medical examiner later revealed something haunting. Some of Sarah's wounds weren't immediately fatal. A bloody glove print on shelving above her body showed that she tried with all her might to pull herself up after being shot. The weapon was immediately identified as a .32 caliber revolver. The cash from the restaurant, a little over $7,000, including $250 in coins, was gone. Steve's wallet, with $600 in rent money, was gone as well. Now, whoever did this, they took their time. They reloaded their gun, and they left 2 innocent people behind in that cooler. The next day, items belonging to Steve Hampton were found along Ellington Parkway, just thrown out on the roadside. There was a driver's license and a credit card and a movie rental card. And on one of those discarded items, investigators found a single clear thumbprint. But at this point in the story, police have no idea yet who it belonged to. What they did know was that whoever dropped these items did so less than 12 miles away from the crime scene and just over a mile from the future suspect's home. But we're not there yet. Now, let's back up to the night before the murders. 2 employees, Michael Butterworth, who hadn't been able to get in that next morning, and Jason Carter, remembered a man coming by the restaurant around 10 p.m. and he entered through the exit door. He said that he wanted a part-time job and said that he worked at a nearby Shoney's. So he took an application and he asked when the manager, Steve Hampton, would be in that next morning. Carter told him that Steve would be there, but he would be busy until after lunch. That conversation would become a critical piece of the timeline. Now, a week after the murders, Butterworth and Carter and a 3rd employee helped police create a composite sketch. Now, it wasn't perfect, no sketch ever is, but it was consistent with a real man walking the streets of Nashville. But still, there was no name and no arrest. Not yet, at least. So on Sunday morning, several people passing by the Captain D's saw things that just didn't quite sit right with them. Now, at 8:45 a.m., a passerby named Jerry Marlin saw a blue Ford station wagon, and it was oddly parked at an angle behind the building. He didn't know it then, but the car matched a vehicle linked to the future suspect. Now, at 8:50 a.m., Debbie Hines drove by and saw Steve Hampton talking to a tall, dark-haired man holding papers. Now, was it the same man from the night before? Investigators wouldn't know that until months later. At 9:30 a.m., Mark Farmer noticed a small car parked the wrong way in the lot and a man walking very fast towards it. Tall, muscular build, slick back hair, and white, not new tennis shoes. Now, when the man noticed Farmer watching, he dropped his head and climbed into the passenger side of the car. Farmer didn't know it at the time, but he had witnessed the killer leaving the scene. But again, police wouldn't put these pieces together until much later. Now, as the days passed after the Captain D's murders, detectives found themselves knee-deep in tips and guesses, rumors, and people trying to be helpful in all the wrong ways. Folks were calling in everything from suspicious cars to suspicious cousins. One man swore he saw a ghostly figure in a trench coat near the restaurant. Another insisted the killer had to be part of a gang because regular people don't do things like this. And while, yes, regular people shouldn't do things like that, sometimes they do. But through all the noise, something else was happening. A kind of quiet fear was settling over Nashville. Restaurants across the city, especially fast food chains, started locking their doors earlier. Managers rode employees home. Nobody wanted to take out the trash alone after dark. And parents were telling their teenagers, just quit that job, baby. Ain't no burger worth your life. Now, detectives knew that they were looking for someone bold, someone who could walk into a well-lit business, overpower two employees, and take his sweet time. Someone who wasn't afraid of witnesses, fingerprints, or cameras. Someone who moved through these spaces like he belonged there. And as they would soon learn, he did. Now, meanwhile, in Brentwood, while Nashville was still trying to find its feet after losing Steve Hampton and Sarah Jackson, folks just 15 miles away were about to be thrown into a nightmare of their own. It was March 23rd, 1997, just a little over a month after the Captain D's murders. A chilly Sunday morning in Brentwood. The McDonald's on Franklin Road should have been bustling with the breakfast rush, but instead, customers found the doors locked and no employees in sight. At first, people thought it was just a late opening. I mean, that does happen sometimes. But when the manager arrived and used her keys to get inside, she found a sight that made her scream for help. Andrea Brown, age 17, a McDonald's employee known for her big smile and bigger heart, was lying on the floor near the back. Beside her were Robert Bobby Sewell, age 23, a cheerful young man who loved cars and dreamed of starting his own detailing business, and Ronald Santiago, age 27, who left behind a wife and a child. All three had been brutally murdered, execution style, just like Captain D's. Cash registers were empty. The safe had been cleaned out. $3,000 later, and once again, the killer had vanished without a trace. But this was different from Captain D's because although Jose Gonzalez, just 27, a cook who worked double shifts to send money home to his family, had been a victim as well, things didn't go quite to plan for the killer. He tried to shoot Jose, and as he had done the others, but the gun malfunctioned. So Jose took that opportunity to fight back. He was not going to be number 4 on that day. Jose was ultimately stabbed 17 times, and as we know, the killer got away for now. But although he left Jose for dead, he survived. Now, the community of Brentwood was usually calm, quiet, and almost sleepy. But suddenly it felt like it had been hit by a freight train. People who never locked their doors started double-checking it. Other fast food restaurants started keeping back doors bolted shut, even during deliveries. And the whispers began. Is it the same guy from Nashville? Is someone hunting restaurant workers? Why Brentwood? Why McDonald's? Why these kids? I mean, nobody knew the answers. Not yet. It felt like the city was under siege. Law enforcement now had 2 massacres at 2 fast food restaurants. 5 victims, all executed. 2 robberies, and no suspects. So at this point, the FBI was called in. Behavioral profilers began building a psychological sketch. The killer was confident and comfortable, organized, and most disturbingly of all, he was escalating. Now, agents suggested the killer likely lived close to the restaurants. Maybe he'd even worked in fast food before. I mean, he knew closing procedures. He knew about safes and shifts. He knew where employees would be and when. He didn't panic. He didn't rush. And he didn't care who he hurt to get the money. Now, detectives had to admit it was starting to look like Nashville had a serial killer. Then came the case that tied everything together. The disappearance of 2 young women from a Baskin-Robbins in Clarksville, Tennessee. It was April 23rd, 1997, just 1 month after the McDonald's murders and just a hair over 2 months from the Captain D's murders. And it was just after closing time. Angela Holmes, 21, a sweet, shy churchgoer known for baking cookies for her neighbors, and Michelle Mace, 16, bubbly, full of teenage energy, working her first job, vanished without a trace. When officers arrived, the shop was empty. Lights on, doors unlocked. No cash in the registers, no girls. Their purses were still inside. Their keys were still on the counter. Their cars were still parked outside. It looked as if they had simply evaporated. Now, their families immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Angela's mother said Angela would never leave work without calling home. Michelle's older sister said Michelle was afraid of the dark behind the store and would have never walked out alone, at least not voluntarily. Now, a massive search kicked off, complete with helicopters and dogs, volunteers, and police across multiple counties. And 2 days later, all hope was shattered. Angela and Michelle's bodies were found in Dunbar Cave State Park in a wooded area. They had been brutally murdered and left among the trees. The scene was so horrific, investigators knew instantly. This was the same man who had killed the employees at Captain D's and the same man who had killed the employees at the McDonald's. There was no more guessing. No hope that it was random. No chance that these were unrelated. Someone was targeting young, hard-working, fast food employees, some barely out of childhood, and slaughtering them for pocket change. The city had reached its breaking point. Now, by this point, Nashville and its surrounding communities were absolutely exhausted. Restaurants were installing panic buttons. Chains were changing their closing procedures. Managers were begging corporate to hire security guards. And parents were still telling their kids, please just quit. I'll help you find something else. People were looking over their shoulders in parking lots. Delivery drivers refused to go out back alone. Night shift workers called each other just so they could walk safely to their cars. Fear had absolutely seeped into the bones of Middle Tennessee. Everyone was waiting for police to say something, anything, that meant the nightmare was ending. And then, finally, a break in the case came. Not from a fingerprint, and not from a witness, but because the killer made one mistake, a small, stupid, reckless mistake, and it opened the floodgates. And that mistake would finally reveal the man responsible for the string of horrific murders that had held Tennessee hostage for months. The break finally came in late April of 1997. And it wasn't from a dramatic confession, and it wasn't from a survivor's account, not from some fancy forensic test like you see on TV. No, this break came from something almost embarrassingly small. A man walked into a fast food restaurant, not to rob it, not to hurt anyone, but for a job. He wanted to apply. But when he came in all scratched up and bleeding, the employees took notice. They whispered among themselves, and they watched him as he tried to act normal. But the whole situation felt strange enough that someone called the police to say, "Hey, we've got a guy here with injuries, and he seems real nervous. It might be nothing, but it might be something." And honey, it was something. The man's name was Paul Dennis Reed, also known as Justin Parks. He had come to Nashville after he underwent plastic surgery after a wreck so that he could be a thriving country music star. But he failed, so fast food it was. Now, police didn't know yet what they had stumbled onto. At first, it just seemed like a welfare check. Somebody who needed help, or maybe he had gotten into a fight. But when officers arrived, Reed grew really uneasy. He started giving strange explanations about how he'd gotten hurt, and his story changed more than once. Now, like I said in the last episode, guys, you don't have to remember a story if you're telling the truth. One officer, the kind who had been on the job long enough to trust his gut, noticed Reed's hands. They weren't scraped from a fall. They looked like they'd been injured during a struggle, like he had been fighting someone trying desperately to get away from him. Now, Reed was taken in for questioning. He wasn't arrested, not yet, but the detectives noticed something. He was very nervous and overly talkative and strangely defensive for a man who was supposedly innocent. And then, when his fingerprints were checked, everything changed. His prints matched evidence found in one of the victim's abandoned cars from the Captain D's murders. Now, suddenly, this wasn't a welfare check. It wasn't a misunderstanding. And they weren't talking to a witness. They were looking straight at the suspected fast food serial killer. Now, before detectives confronted him, they had to learn who they were dealing with. And what they found painted a picture that was chilling. Not because he was mysterious or brilliant or cunning, but because he was very ordinary. Reed was a struggling young man from Texas, again, moved to Nashville in hopes of becoming a country music star. He had bounced from job to job, including, you guessed it, fast food restaurants. He knew the procedures, he knew the layouts, and he knew the rhythms of closing time. Now, his dream of fame fizzled out quickly. He had a history of robberies. He had trouble holding down work. And he was angry. He was angry at the world. He was angry at employers. He was angry at the fact that nothing in his life was going the way that he thought it should. And with each failed attempt to make it, he spiraled deeper into frustration. And then he turned that frustration outward. He chose victims who were young and hardworking and completely powerless against a grown man with a gun. He chose places that he understood and places that felt familiar. He chose restaurants where he could just blend into the background. And worst of all, he kept killing because he wanted money. Not fame, not revenge, not ideology, just money. He took lives for cash and not even very much of it. Now, once police had Paul Dennis Reed in their sights, the evidence started stacking up faster than they could really process it. His car had matched witness descriptions from multiple crime scenes. His fingerprints popped up again and again and again. Shoe prints found at more than one murder site matched his shoes exactly. A receipt found in Paul Dennis Reed's possession lined up perfectly with the timeline of the Baskin-Robbins abductions. Phone records placed him near multiple fast food restaurants right around the times of the murders. He even had the scratches and the bruises consistent with the girls from the Baskin-Robbins fighting for their lives. And then, as investigators combed through his home, they found personal items believed to belong to the victims. Small things, but meaningful in only way that evidence can be. Now, let's be clear here. No one piece of evidence is usually enough to seal a murder. But this wasn't one piece. This was a mountain. A mountain that reached from Nashville to Brentwood to Clarksville. A mountain of fingerprints and fibers and receipts, footprints and lies. Now, Paul Dennis Reed tried to talk his way out of it. He blamed literally everyone else. He said investigators were confused or incompetent. But facts don't care about feelings. And facts don't change because someone's story does. The truth was catching up to him, and it was catching up fast. So on June 27th, 1997, after weeks of surveillance and questioning and evidence collection, police made their move. Paul Dennis Reed was officially arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Now, by now, the city was practically holding its breath. People who had been too scared to work night shifts began to relax just a little. Fast food restaurants started going back to their normal hours. Workers felt a little better walking to their cars. But for the families of the victims, no amount of relief could undo what they had lost. Justice was coming, yes, but their children were gone. Their siblings, their friends. And the hardest part was that their kids had been doing everything right, working honest jobs, saving money, just trying to get through school or pay bills or save up for a car. And for that, they were executed. Now, with Paul Dennis Reed in custody and evidence beginning to pile up, prosecutors prepared for a legal battle that would last years and bring national attention to Tennessee. Once Paul Dennis Reed was behind bars, Middle Tennessee felt a shift. Not quite peace and not yet relief, but a moment to finally breathe. Families who had spent months waking up every morning in fear now had a name and a face and a suspect. And prosecutors, they were preparing for one of the largest, most emotionally charged cases the area had ever seen. This wasn't just one murder trial. It was 7 counts of first-degree murder, 3 separate crime scenes, 3 devastated communities, and all of these grieving families waiting for some sort of justice. Now, from the very beginning, Reed's behavior was very unpredictable. Some days he would sit quietly, just staring straight ahead, and other days he rambled about conspiracies, insisting that he'd been framed. He filed bizarre written statements claiming that law enforcement was involved in a plot against him. And at various points, he refused to cooperate with his very own lawyers. He would fire them and rehire them and fire them again. But his antics didn't make him look mentally ill in the legal sense. They made him just look manipulative. And the juries, frankly, were not impressed. Paul Dennis Reed's attempts to derail the process did not work. The prosecution had so much physical evidence, forensic evidence, timeline evidence, and even behavioral evidence linking Reed to the crimes. All of them. And there were so many threads tied back to him that his denial came across as desperate rather than believable. Now, the first of the trials focused on the murders of Steve Hampton and Sarah Jackson, the young manager and the teenage employee found shot execution style inside the Captain D's on Lebanon Road. The prosecution laid out the events methodically. Reed arrived at the restaurant before opening. He forced the employees inside. He bound them. He robbed the safe. He executed them to eliminate witnesses, and he fled in Steve Hampton's vehicle. Every step of that morning was documented with evidence. DNA from the abandoned car, Reed's fingerprints on multiple surfaces, shoes matching the prints found at the scene. The juries listened, the families listened, the entire city, watching on TV or reading the news, listened. And when the verdict came back, it was swift. Guilty on all counts. Reed was sentenced to death for the murders of Steve Hampton and Sarah Jackson. Next came the Brentwood McDonald's case, the murders of Andrea Brown, Bobby Sewell, and Robert Santiago. All three had been found shot, execution style, inside the restaurant. The prosecution presented the same method of operation. He arrived early, he forced entry, controlled the victims, robbed the safe, kill everyone. Well, he thought. Once again, there was a mountain of evidence and a survivor to tell the tale. Phone records, timeline analysis, witness sightings that placed a man fitting Paul Dennis Reed's description near the restaurant before dawn. Ballistics and forensic results that matched weapons linked right back to him. And once again, the jury had no trouble reaching a decision. Guilty. Death sentence. Another 3 families finally had an answer. Not closure, because, frankly, closure may be a myth, but at least they had justice. Then came the final major trial centered around the abduction and murders of Angela Holmes and Michelle Mace, the 2 young women who disappeared from the Clarksville Baskin-Robbins and were later found in Dunbar Cave State Park. This trial was perhaps the hardest emotionally. Angela and Michelle were so young and so hopeful and so full of life. The courtroom felt a little heavier and quieter when their names were said. The story the prosecution presented was harrowing. Reed entered the shop at closing time. He forced the girls to leave with him. He made them get into the car, a car his fingerprints were later found in. He drove them to a secluded location, and he murdered them brutally, attempting to conceal the crime by hiding their bodies in the woods. Now, evidence from the park, combined with vehicle evidence and timeline analysis and forensic matches, painted a picture that the defense simply could not counter. And once again, the jury deliberated guilty, death sentence. Now, in every trial, after every verdict, came the hardest part, the victim impact statements. Parents and siblings and partners and friends all standing in front of the man who took their loved ones away from them, telling the court about the holes left in their hearts. Steve Hampton's parents talked about their son who worked tirelessly to support his young family. Sarah Jackson's mother talked about a daughter who never got to learn to drive or go to prom. Families of Andrea and Bobby and Robert described empty chairs at holidays and birthdays that would never be celebrated again. Michelle Mace's family talked about the dreams that she had of going to college, all dreams that were cut short. Some statements were angry, wouldn't you be? Some were heartbreakingly calm, and some couldn't get through their words without absolutely breaking down. And Paul Dennis Reed, well, he sat there and remained largely unmoved, sat expressionless, and rarely made eye contact. What a coward. After the trials, Reed spent years filing appeals. He tried to argue ineffective counsel. He tried to blame prosecutors for misconduct. He even claimed more than once that he was innocent despite overwhelming evidence. But none of his appeals stuck. And then, in a twist nobody saw coming, Reed attempted to waive his appeals and accept execution. Now, for a moment, it seemed like he was ready to face the consequences. But soon after, he reversed himself again, claiming that he hadn't been in the right mental state to make that decision. It was a pattern that continued for years. Appeals, withdrawals, repeat. Claim incompetence, claim innocence, repeat. Every turn of events kept the victims' families locked in a frustrating cycle of waiting. Now, the years following the trials saw Tennessee making major changes to protect fast food and retail workers. Improved security, new closing protocols, mandatory two-person policies, and panic alarms became standard. Restaurants in Nashville still talk about the Reed years, a reminder of how fragile everyday simple routines can be. Teenage workers still hear warnings from parents who lived through that fear of the 90s. And even now, decades later, their survivors and their families remember every single detail. Because tragedies like these don't just fade away. They settle into the bones of a community. They become part of its history. A painful part, yes, but one that shapes how people care for and protect each other moving forward. Now, after all trials concluded, Paul Dennis Reed was officially sentenced to death for his crimes. He was transferred to Riverbend Maximum Security Prison, where he spent the remainder of his life on death row. For Reed, the prison walls weren't just confinement. They were a stage. He continued to draw attention with letters and strange behavior and repeated appeals. His attempts to delay justice became almost routine. Yet behind bars, frankly, he was powerless. No fast food restaurants, no victims to terrorize, only the cold, controlled reality of prison life. While the legal battles raged, the families of Reed's victims faced the ongoing reality of grief. For them, the news of guilty verdicts didn't erase the trauma. It confirmed the loss while providing a measure of justice. Many families became advocates for victims' rights and workplace safeties, And some families sought therapy and support groups, learning to live with the absence of their loved ones while honoring their memory. The community remembered and celebrated and mourned them every year. Now, Paul Dennis Reed remained on death row for over a decade, living under strict supervision. His health declined over time, and in his final years, he became quieter and less combative and less in the public eye. Now, ultimately, Reed never saw the electric chair or lethal injection because he died in custody in 2013, reportedly from natural causes, complications due to pneumonia and heart failure and upper respiratory issues. And his death brought mixed emotions, as it would. It was relief for some who awaited justice, but it was frustration for others who wanted the execution carried out. Lingering grief that would never disappear for those families. Even in death, Reed's story remained a reminder of the vulnerability of ordinary lives and the devastating impact of violent crime. And decades later, Middle Tennessee still remembers the fast food murders. Yet there's resilience too. Communities learn to watch out for one another and implement those stronger safety measures and support victims' families in their healing. Memories of Steve and Sarah and Andrea, Bobby, Robert, Angela, and Michelle are preserved in stories, memorials, and lessons that keep the community vigilant and caring. Paul Dennis Reed's crimes left scars that time cannot fully erase. They remind us that evil can strike anywhere, even in the most ordinary settings: a restaurant, a parking lot, a workplace. But they also remind us of human resilience, the courage of families who faced unimaginable loss, the commitment of law enforcement and prosecutors who sought justice, and the vigilance of communities determined to protect each other. The fast food murders of 1997 were horrific, yes, but the aftermath demonstrates something equally profound. Even in tragedy, humanity finds ways to endure, remember, and heal. Thank you for listening in again, friends. This episode, Drive Through Death, was written and hosted by me, Tiffany Morgan, and produced by Main Street Media. Background music and theme song by John T. Productions. Research support from Court Archives, State of Tennessee versus Paul Dennis Reed, and WKRN News. Now, if you'd like to sponsor an episode, we would love to partner with you. Our sponsors keep our shows funded and running. To further support Tennessee True Crime, follow us on Facebook at Tennessee True Crime and Instagram at TN True Crime, and invite your true crime friends to join as well. You can also find case and evidence photos on those socials. Now, if you have a case that you're interested in me covering, please feel free to email me at tntruecrime@mainstreetmedia.llc. Join me next week as we uncover another Tennessee case that left a lasting mark. Because here in Tennessee, we never stop telling the stories that matter. And some secrets we refuse to let stay buried.
Through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee. True crime. Dark tales in the mountains where the mist won't lie, echoes of the fallen under starless skies. Hear the hush of memory, the voice of the unsaid. This is